My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old-school RPG podcast.
And on this episode, Children of the Sun, see your time has just begun. We seek the truth of the legend of the Golden Condor.
Our first segment is the Basic Brawl. The Legend of the Golden Condor is a 23-page adventure for the Elephant and Macaw Banner RPG, first published in Portuguese by De Vere in 2017 and in English by Porcupine Publishing in 2019. It was written by J.M. Beraldo, edited by Douglas Quinta Hayes, art by Jan Kiohara, Andre Meister, Hernando Souza, and Guilherme de Cas. Graphics, layout, and cartography are by Felipe Borin. It's based on the books by Christopher Kastenschmidt.
As for the contents of the adventure, they go like this. We begin with the story so far. The background is that some daft nobleman, one Don Casimiro, went off into the jungle looking for the Holy Grail. Spoiler, he didn't find it, and the player characters are required to go and find him. And in return, they'll get quite a sizable reward. Then comes the adventure overview, which gives you a roughly expected rundown of what's going to happen. It's a point crawl that doesn't have a fixed order, but this gives you a rough idea of what's likely to occur when. Then we get the introduction, which is an opening scene at a riverside camp for travellers and traders where the player characters rest before setting out on the tough part of their journey into the forest. Then we have a series of point crawl locations, beginning with the São Mateus Fort, where the heroes encounter a family of wild pigs and traces of Dom Casimiro's expedition. They also find a soldier called Virgilio, who escaped from the final boss monster encounter site, but was driven mad in the process and is curled up in a fetal position in the fort's chapel. They also find, conveniently, a tall watchtower that, if anyone thinks to climb up there and draw a map, helps them get the lay of the land. The next main location is the Hermit's cabin. This is where a priest lives, or rather used to live, because by the time our heroes get there, he has been murdered by the villainous Don Casimiro. He is also surrounded by some giant mosquitoes who provide an unfriendly welcome for anyone trying to get into his hut. The next location is the Shamans Camp, where they meet Ruda, the page. Page being a kind of, healer and shaman for the indigenous people. He can, if asked nicely, provide aid and advice. Heading further into the jungle on the trail of Don Casimiro, we then encounter the Protectors of the Forest. They are a group of warriors from a particularly isolationist Tupiniquim indigenous community, and they mistakenly think that the PCs are coming out of the Forbidden Swamp rather than in, and essentially force them back, as they see it, into the swampland. That swamp is not a good place to be, as we discover in the next location, the Slough of Despond, where the party is gradually surrounded and then attacked by dry bodies, evil people turned into tree monsters that drain life. Beyond that gauntlet lies the village, destroyed but a long time ago, not by Don Casimiro in some kind of vengeful attack, but a long time before anyone in this adventure was born. And there we get a weird vision stroke flashback in which the native village is crushed by interlopers from the far north. After that vision, luckily the heroes will now know where they need to go to find the Grotto of the Sun. Outside this cave there are two terrified sentries. Inside, a terrible lake monster that has already killed some of Don Casimiro's soldiers, and an out-of-place mummy, and Don Casimiro himself, who is in all kinds of trouble by this point. At this stage, the PCs are kind of expected to try and rescue him, even though they've determined by now that he's really an awful person, so that's debatable. The adventure ends with a conclusion and a set of pre-generated characters.
Let's talk about our experience with this module. I've only read it in preparation for this.
I ran it in one session using the Elephant and Macaw Banner rule system and using the pre-generated PCs. It's important at this moment, I think, to put in a disclaimer, which is that I am also the publisher of this adventure and the translator of the English version. So, weigh everything I say with a grain of salt at this point, I suppose.
Yes, perhaps. We shall see. I trust you. I trust your honesty. Looking at the notes, I feel like you're not being biased.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't actually write it, so I mean, I'm not reviewing the English prose as far as I know. So I'm, I genuinely like and maybe less like different parts of it. So we'll see.
Indeed. Well, let's talk about what we liked. Actually, even before we start there, would you just give us a quick overview of the Elephant and Macaw Banner? I have a feeling that some listeners are not going to know what it is, and I'm only just surface level kind of familiar with it just because I know you. So what is the Elephant and the Macaw Banner RPG?
Oh, sure. So let's begin with the novelettes, as they were. So there's a series of slightly longer than short stories written by Christopher Caston Smith, which are part of the Elephant and Macaw Banner series. And they follow the adventures of two adventurers, one African former slave and a Dutch adventurer who's recently demobbed from the army. And they essentially go from town to town having Monster of the Week adventures, fighting monsters for local communities, and eventually not quite living in an indigenous village, but hanging around their community a lot. And so all the creatures that they encounter are drawn from Brazilian folklore in its various types. And like the headless mule, or that I've forgotten the name of it right now, but the thing where an evil person can just like detach their head and fly around as a flaming skull by night, and all this kind of thing. And so it's not exactly young adult stuff. It's maybe a little bit kind of older pitch than that, but it's that kind of wholesome exploration and adventure fiction. And then the role-playing game, which came out a few years back now in Brazil, is the game version of that, pretty simply.
Awesome. Great. Thank you for that. So things we liked. I'll kick off by saying that there's a portion in the very beginning of the module called the Adventure Overview that basically runs down like in a few paragraphs, like everything that you're going to be getting up to or could be getting up to in this adventure. And I really like that. I thought it was a really thoughtful touch. And I wish more modules did this. This is a thing that I wish more modules would do. I think it shows a lot of consideration for the GM. And you really miss things like that, particularly in the really old modules that we sometimes cover on this show, where it's just great big walls of 2-column text and no easy division of it, Yeah. So I thought that was a great thing just to kind of note here at the beginning. I love that. And anyone listening to this who's writing modules, that's my internal PDF bookmarking. I love little summaries at the beginning of like what the adventure is about. I think the artwork is very nice. I would say objectively nice. It's not to my taste, if I'm being honest. I personally am not into that kind of painterly style. There's a sort of painterly style that's very popular in particularly in big budget RPGs. It's kind of very 5e-ish, very World of Warcrafty. People obviously love it, and listeners, you will probably love it. I just am not super into it because I like the kind of more scribbly black and white kind of art style, but it is very, very nice.
It is indeed. I also, it's not my favorite style of art, but I do like these. I especially like there's an illustration of the dry bodies, the corpus equus, menacing a party by night that I think is particularly effective. So yeah, it's really good stuff. And there's actually quite a number of different artists that have worked on it, but they all seem to be, like, it doesn't look like a mishmash.
Yeah, it's a very unified look. I think that it's probably a very unified look because it's a very popular style.
That's
right?
probably it, yeah.
It's a really, really popular, like listeners, like you'll know what I'm talking about. Like it's World of Warcraft does it. I think World of Warcraft kind of popularized this painterly style of fantasy drawing, and with like very, very bold colors and not like hyper realistic, but like very close to kind of a realistic textures and things. It's very nice, maybe not to my taste. I think more importantly, The Legend of the Golden Condor, this feels very authentic. I'm sure this is down to the background of like, and the origin of like how this module came about, but it feels very authentic, very well researched. The language, the details, the cultural notes, it's all very convincing, and it feels special. I think this adventure would feel considerably less special if it didn't have all those cultural touchstones baked into it.
Yeah, I mean, one of my reservations about it at first is that, to explore the backstory a bit, is that the gold that has been discovered and therefore leads people to think that, the Holy Grail might be knocking about, is actually from the necklace and I think headdress of this mummified ancient queen who is from the Inca, i.e. way off to the north, up towards Central America, from a tribe that escaped some kind of disaster and did an Exodus-style journey all the way south into what's now Brazil. And I was a bit worried, thinking, like, is this that good? Like, if someone signs up for, I want to play a game in 16th century Brazil, but this adventure's all about the Inca, is that okay? But,
right, yeah.
But the more I think of it, I think it's okay, because this monster, essentially, is an interloper. Just like you, playing the French and Spanish and Dutch, in large part, are also interlopers who probably shouldn't be here. And so in that sense, I think the parallel works quite well. And also, everything else that you encounter is sufficiently Brazilian to make that not too bad.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Incan or Andean mummy or whatever the monster's called at the end, that does not feel like even like a tenth of what you're going to be spending your time doing, right? Like the vast majority of the module is like truly feels very Brazilian. Actually, kind of piggybacking on what you just said a bit, I think one of my favorite things about this is the sort of confusion going on with Casimiro, because he believes, if my read is correct, he believes that he has found the Holy Grail, right? He thinks this is about Jesus. And it's not. It's this other thing. It's this fantastical, non-Christian sort of like mythical thing going on. And even more interesting, it's not even a legend that's like local to that area.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
It's like, it also, like you said, it's also an interloping thing. And I just kind of love that I love that confusion. I love that commentary that the colonizer has this very, very like Western kind of view of like what is happening, right? And it's just wrong, What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's good. It's a great bit of irony, and I say great, I mean, it's pretty dark, because he's killed people after this mistaken idea, which is awful. And so it is interesting because it's quite a happy-go-lucky toned adventure in general, but a lot of the stuff that's going on here is just sad. So yeah, it's good. Yeah, it's a good critique of how people will rush to snap judgments and kind of follow only the evidence that kind of tells them what they want to hear. Also, it leads to just a nice debate at the end, which is, do we really want to bother rescuing this guy? And I think in our game, the answer was yes, because the reward is it's a big reward. And some of the pre-generated player characters owe a lot of money to some nasty people. So I think they did, but they didn't enjoy rescuing him, because they certainly felt he didn't deserve it.
He is a bad guy. The last thing I'll throw in is I think the monsters are very interesting here. I need to go back and look at that illustration, because I had a hard time kind of imagining what are they called? The dry corpses or dry bodies?
Dry bodies, yeah.
Yeah, what the dry bodies look like from the description. I mean, the description was fascinating, but I had a hard time kind of like imagining them in my head.
I think that's part of the problem with, if you are using actual folkloric monsters as opposed to inventing your own, like that D&D has classically done, is that, of course, folklore sources tend to disagree with each other about what does a goblin look like from one place to another. It'll be different. But I mean, yeah, the shorthand is evil trees, evil clawed trees.
That's what I kind of was leaning toward. Yeah, I think maybe it's the fact they were called dry bodies. I thought that was kind of it's interesting, and actually, and I wondered if it was just down to the translation and like kind of the way we interpret the words. But as I think on it, it's kind of amusing that like the dry bodies would be an animated tree. I don't know. There's something kind of funny about that. Anything else you want to add about things you liked here?
Yeah, sure. One of the recurring details that I liked from this, and I think the writer, J.M. Beraldo, has done well, is that a lot of the treasures and things you encounter along the way are quite, for want of a better word, just simple. You pick up some supplies of cured meat, or you find mosquito balm, or you pick up someone's violin. And the violin actually is a useful item because it belongs to Virgilio, the deranged soldier. And I like how it kind of emphasizes that in this wilderness, quite basic things are very important and valuable to you. And it's not Although there is gold and jewellery and things lying around, the actually important things are what you're going to eat and drink for the next few days.
Fantastic. Well, shall we move on to questions then?
Yeah, sure.
Why don't you start?
I've claimed in the past that this adventure would be easy to use with games not set in 16th century Brazil. Is that really true, do you think, from a read?
I don't think it's a matter so much of would it be easy to do or not, as much as it's a question of would you want to? I think that's the more interesting question, because I think part of what makes this adventure interesting, and indeed I suspect what makes the Elephant and the Macaw Banner interesting, is the setting, right? And if you take it out of 16th century Brazil, I wonder if this would be your go-to module, right? I'm not sure about that. I'm not totally sure. And that's not a criticism of the module so much as it's just to say that I think the setting is very fascinating. And I think if you're going to if this has caught your eye, that's probably why, right? So that's my thinking on it. Would it be easy to do? Yeah, I think it'd be okay. You'd have to definitely change a lot of names, right? And a lot of kind of setting assumptions, I suppose. But the basic through line, the fort, going through the sort of creepy forest and the monsters that you deal with, and the final encounter, pretty straightforward, I think.
Although, speaking of that final encounter, there is a bit of the Westworld scene waiting for you to come along and see it happen. When you get to the Grotto of the Sun and Don Casimiro is there, I think is he transfixed by looking at the mummy?
Indeed, yeah.
So does this need maybe what happens if your PCs take weeks to travel to the cave rather than days?
I don't think so, because I feel like there's a certain amount of artifice in tabletop role-playing games that you have to expect, right? It's kind of unavoidable. And I think if you took several weeks, you could, maybe Dom Casimiro's lost a little bit of weight. Maybe he is not that jolly barrel-chested fellow that's drawn so well in the beginning of the module. Maybe he's a little thinner. Maybe he's gone a little unhinged or whatever. I don't know, but I don't think it would really need that.
Well, do you have any questions?
I do have one. So this is really more of this is about the translation, I think, or about the presentation of this, because I'm always fascinated by stuff like this. But I would say that the prose feels, I don't think dry is the right word, but I don't think it has a lot of humor to it, for sure. It feels a little kind of just straightforward. What's the reason behind that? To
be fair, I'm not totally. I need to clarify this with Chris at some point. But the reason it's like that in English is I found that the main rulebook, which I've just about mostly finished translating, and then this, both had a kind of not academic thing, but they were quite formal, right? There's no slang in there. There are not really any jokes, which I think is to do with one of the features that EAMB, the game, has that the books don't, which is the books are just adventure novels. They do have bits and pieces of, colloquialism, fun and games, and it's quite emotively written. Whereas the role-playing game has an appendix about how to use it in the classroom, because part of its intention was to be used in schools in Brazil as a history teaching kind of tool. And in fact, part of the print run was bought or co-funded, I keep forgetting, by the Ministry of Education in Brazil.
Oh.
And so it has this kind of, not formal, but I think slightly didactic tone to it, which I tried to preserve in the English as well, right?
Didactic is the right word. That's the word I'm looking for. Yeah, when I was reading it, it's very clear. I think it would be very, very easy to run. But it didn't have that, I don't know, it was kind of missing some authorial voice or spark or something, right?
Yeah, I feel like it's trying to explain things to you without being, it seems to try and avoid too much voice, and I have to kind of stop myself from adding things when I do translate it. The way I would put it, I have to go, no, don't do that. Do it the other way. And I mean, I hope that's the right thing to do. But when you translate things, this is always difficult, deciding, if you think, I think I could put this better than the author did originally. Well, that's not really your job. Your job is to render what the author did in the target language. Although, since I'm also the publisher of this thing, I have in some places there are a few bits that are slightly different from the Portuguese to English wordings or instructions, because I felt like it would be okay to, slip in a bit of what I consider my expertise in terms of how to present things to players.
Awesome. Let's go to the chain lightning round. I quite like the half-page map on page 8 of the Fort San Mateus. It is a simple map, but it's colorful, nicely detailed, and it seems like it'd be fun to slap down on the table.
If attacked, Ruda, the shaman, leaps away in the direction of the river and turns into an eel.
Near the end of the module, there's a section called Ideas for Other Adventures, which explains some ways that you can continue the adventure, some little spin-offs and story hooks that are inspired by the module. I thought that was really smart and well appreciated.
As the PCs head into the swamp, the Tupiniquins, observing them, sing a low song that the knowledgeable recognize as a lament for those who have died, whether they are friends or enemies. But this song is being sung for the player characters, even though they are alive for now.
I like that you have some fun bookending with the illustrations in the module. On the cover, we see the priestess, who is the sort of central figure of the legend. We see her looking very vibrant and alive and powerful. And then that's sort of bookended near the end with an illustration of her as a mummy. I thought that was just some nice visual symmetry.
And in the Slough of Despond, I enjoyed, especially in play, the slow reveal of the dry bodies that are secretly, hundreds of them all around the PCs, as the heroes go through the swamp and discover bits and pieces of the dead soldiers' belongings, hanging from tree branches or twisted into and around the trunks.
Let's go to the Expert Delve. It's the Expert Delve. There's a portion, a paragraph, in fact, of this adventure, which talks about some downtime or some sort of pre-adventure kind of activities that the characters might be doing while they're in the village. The quote here that is really operative is, "Let the participants test their skills. A friendly shooting competition may arise between characters, or perhaps someone wants to fish, cook, or sew a banner for the group. Another interesting activity would be to try to get information about the region." I really liked this. It inspired me to think about downtime. That is to say, in fiction downtime in party-based adventure games, right? And I think that our orientation here on Fear of a Black Dragon, generally speaking, is to skip this, right? At least for me, I'm a big proponent of just hard frame right up to the dungeon. Like, who gives a shit what came before, right? Like, we are on the road to adventure, right? And this is probably because in recent years, I've mostly kind of stuck to shorter campaigns, short series of games. But I think that we tend to kind of focus on everything that's not the downtime part of the characters' lives. Is that fair?
A bit. I mean, I've always been an advocate of having I do like a tavern scene or an opium den scene in Yunsuin, but not at the beginning. Yeah, so it's always part of the story and action. So is it really downtime the way I tend to do it? No, probably not. But I like a bit of faffing around, usually in the middle of the session, like start fast, end strong, and have some kind of chit-chat and nonsense in between. Yeah.
I mean, I do too, if I'm being honest. I think it's just that I think we haven't really emphasized it on the show before. So I think that that's what I want to talk about. This idea of activities at camp, in the village, in the city, downtime activities, and how to make them an enjoyable part of the game, an enjoyable part of the campaign. So I will say at the outset that I think you probably don't want to spend too much time on downtime activities. You can make it a fun, enriching part of the experience, but I think it should not be the main experience or even half or even a tenth maybe of the experience. A small caveat to that for scenes at camp, like kind of when you're in the middle of the adventure, but we'll kind of put a pin in that for now. So I want to kind of throw that out there. Like, I think there's a danger of making this too much a part of the game. That just could be my biases at play. I'm not sure, but that's my instinct. I'll tell you though, one of my favorite memories from childhood is playing a video game on the Super Nintendo called The Legend of Mystical Ninja. Do you remember that one? It was called Goemon in other regions.
I do not. I don't know. I never had a SNES anyway. So yeah.
Oh, SNES. That makes my teeth hurt.
I can redo that line if you want.
It's okay. So this game, The Legend of Mystical Ninja, for folks who remember it, it had terrific mini games. So like in the middle of this sort of combat and the adventure, you would just dive into these little huts to do, to bet on horses or to, play games of poker or whatever, right? There's all kinds of little mini games you could do. And they were interspersed in a way that they were kind of like a really fun and indeed a very significant part of the game. And for a long time, my role-playing games really incorporated stuff like this. I always wanted to incorporate these sort of like little downtime activities, right? And it can work, but I think, again, you have to be kind of careful with it or players will kind of start to resent it. I remember in my early days of running Dungeon World, I did a campaign where we had a whole session of just city-based activities. There was like contests and a pub crawl, fortune telling, and all that kind of stuff, right? The players enjoyed it, but I got this like sort of universal piece of feedback, which was, we're glad this was only for one session. Because while I had frankly, had made what I consider to be a brilliant set of mini games and custom moves to support this session, the players just wanted to be on the adventure, right? They wanted to be finding treasure, killing things, getting on with the story. And I can't really blame them, right? So I think that there's just a balance here. I think you can make this a fun part of the game without overdoing it. I think setting expectations is really important. If you're going to do a full downtime session, I think you probably need to make sure the players understand what you're getting into. I will throw in that some games have incorporated downtime very, very well into their core rule set and are a core part of the experience. I think the best examples here, for me at least, that I can think of from recent memory is Blades in the Dark and The Sprawl. I think both of those games do a really good job with like mechanized downtime and might be worth looking at to inspire your own games. But that was a lot of preamble to say that I love this. I love the idea of downtime in role-playing games. You definitely have to be kind of careful with it. What do you think before we kind of like start with specific discussion, because I do have my thoughts divided up in a certain way here. What do you think are just some advantages at the outset of trying to enrich downtime, like trying to make this a fun part of the game?
Okay, I mean, there are a lot. I mean, as someone who once designed a game that is arguably about 50 to 60% downtime, one of the best bits is that it's a great way to reveal character and sort of make everybody become more emotionally invested in these people that you're about to throw down a dungeon to face near certain death. I mean, that I think we'll talk about at some length in the upcoming bit, so I won't dwell on that. Also, a low stakes way to introduce the setting or the systems, especially for new role players. And I think that is, in The Legend of the Golden Condor, that's what that opening scene is for. It's to kind of teach you how to roll the dice if you're doing shooting, or if you don't understand, like, what is this river? What kind of animals are in the jungle? For people to ask those questions in character, which especially for, if you're thinking about the semi-target market of school kids who've maybe not role played before, they might feel awkward about doing that out of character and admitting they don't know stuff, especially if they're meant to have learnt it in Brazilian high school history class. But if they do it in character, that kind of gives them an easier way to do it.
I've just been reminded of Dogs in the Vineyard by Vincent Baker. Dogs in the Vineyard has this brilliant thing in the beginning where before you begin your first mission, you do this like a pre-downtime, which is a strange phrase, but you do this like sort of pre-activity where you show the dogs, they're kind of like missionaries, like sort of religious warrior missionaries. You show them at the training facility, like getting better, right? And you actually have to engage the mechanics, and it's totally low stakes. There's nothing like super, like dangerous or deadly about it, but it gives you a chance to show how the dice work and to sort of kick off the story, much in the same way that scene in The Golden Condor does.
Yeah, I think that may have drawn on the basic intro scenario for Pendragon, where you were expected after you'd been made a knight to try and jump onto your horse with one leap, and everyone had to make that dice roll. Do you remember that?
Yeah. I do, yeah.
Oh, so much more bare bones than the dogs one, of course. But actually, that brings me on to the next thing I think is a good thing in downtime, which is stopping in, for example, a riverside camp. is a great chance for players to restate what their goals are and just to make sure everybody's still on the same page. Someone goes, "So, strangers, what brings you to our part of the world?" And then someone goes, "Well, we're here to hunt this thing." And maybe someone goes, "Oh, yeah, I thought we were doing this." And at that point, any confusion can be ironed out. Or if there is no confusion, then that's fine. And it's good. It's just good to say what you're doing occasionally again. And then sometimes you'll be able to get a bit of backstory for individual characters in as well as that. So that's pretty good. But yeah, I think there is a caveat, or rather a warning here. Just as you should not spend too much time on downtime, I also think you should not make it too exciting. This is meant to be downtime for the characters. It should also be downtime for the players, right? If this is if every time you stop and, have some cheese and bread and wine by the side of the road, it turns into some intense emotional drama that you really have to think about, they're going to want to spend that mental energy on whatever the game is supposed to be about. So just as they would want to spend the time on it. So I think you want to, it needs to still be a break. It needs to be a gentle moment where things are kind of a bit more relaxed than during the high points,
I'm mostly with you on that last point. I think we'll probably get into it a little bit here, but I generally agree with the spirit of what you're saying there. So I have my notes here, and they are copious. If you hadn't picked up from Tom's tone earlier, they are nearly 2 full-ass pages of notes. Okay, so basically, I'm thinking that we have 3 scopes here, right? Okay, I've divided up by scope. I think those 3 scopes are at camp, or to put it another way, like downtime while you're still on the adventure, right? The second one is recuperating / resupplying, which is to say it's a quick break from the adventure, but you anticipate getting back on the adventure, right? And then finally, major downtime between adventures, perhaps in a town or city. I want to talk about each of those 3 things, like ways to enrich each of those 3 scopes of downtime. At camp, you were kind of hinting at this a bit earlier, Tom. I feel like the best way to enrich campfire scenes, is to find ways of focusing on the personal and the interpersonal between the party members, right? I mean, this is a great chance to find out what motivates the individual party member and kind of what do these people think of each other, right? This is a convention of the fantasy adventure genre, right? But I think that many fantasy games tend to overlook this, or it's very easy to overlook these aspects of the genre because we're so focused on fighting and exploring, right? And so I think the way you can sort of draw this out is just through questions. I think very simple questions posed to the players during at camp scenes go a really long way here. For example, how do you pass the time while you're on watch? That moment, like when there's just one character on watch and everyone else is asleep, that's a moment that could be pregnant with danger. Maybe it should be. It is at the very least intimate, right? And I think it's a great opportunity to give that character who is sort of in the spotlight, so to say, or so to speak, a chance to sort of like explain their motivations, right? And so a question like that can go a long way. How do you pass the time while you're on watch? Show us what you do, right? Ask folks, tell me a little bit about the food you brought. Like you're rummaging through your pack. Like why'd you bring that? Why was that important? You know, who back home is supporting you? That kind of thing, right? Questions that sort of point them at each other, right? How did you feel when your companion accidentally led you into that monster's trap? And here, if they give you a good answer, like something that sounds kind of, you know, interesting, juicy, ask if you can frame up a scene where the characters actually discuss it, right? I love moments like that. I think that good campfire scenes, at camp scenes, can set a certain expectation in your overall campaign. I think it gets players thinking about the personal, about intra-party conflict, about camaraderie, about their goals, and so forth. And I think they start to incorporate those ideas into the fabric of what they consider to be important. And it definitely has an effect on gameplay, right? And so if you want to have a campaign where the players are thinking in those terms, not just about the killing, not just about the monsters, not just about treasure, this is a great way of doing that. It's a great way of fostering that. And here's my caveat from earlier when I said that it shouldn't be a major part. I actually think that this at camp time is time very well spent. Depending on the pace and the tone of your game, these scenes can be as much as a quarter of the gameplay, right? Maybe even half if you have a certain type of group that really loves this kind of stuff. And that's where I kind of push back a little bit on what you said earlier about like not having it be too exciting. I think you're right. It doesn't have to be exciting. It doesn't have to be something that draws them away from the adventure, but I do think it can be enriching, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, when I say it shouldn't be too exciting, I do only mean exciting in that sense of, oh, we've got to make moment-by-moment decisions now. Whereas, yeah, I mean, I love a campfire sequence because, you know, they get to make interesting decisions about what they're going to say to each other, how they're going to be with each other, that will then, you know, roll on to subsequent scenes and things that happen and affect how future events play out. And in fact, your mention of kind of stepping out and going meta and saying, can I frame up a bit conversation here? Generally, when I'm GMing, I tend to do you, second person addressing the character, as prescribed in the great book of Dungeon World. But this is one of the places where I more often step out and will say something like, you know, what does Veronica do to pass the time when she's on watch? Because one of the unique strengths that role-playing games have, I think, is the ability for one character to be both a viewpoint character and non-viewpoint at the same time. So even if it's not your PC, you get to hear their internal monologue when the GM asks that question about, you know, what do you think about what happened with your comrade? But also you get to step out of your own character and think, what is it about them that other people see that reflects how I'm feeling about how I fell into a monster's trap because of my comrade and so on? So there's a real variety of ways that you can embody and convey the elements of your character and the kind of story you want to be in and the kind of people you want it to be about. I think it's very difficult to do in other media. And so these campfire scenes are great for that because you just have such visibility on everyone, even though you're ostensibly just playing one part in that drama.
I love it. I absolutely love that. I think you're 100% correct. And again, it kind of goes back to what I was saying. Like, you start creating this culture, right? It's play culture. I mean, that's truly what's happening here. I mean, when you start to have scenes like this, you are creating a play culture at your table. And it's a play culture that values a certain type of characterization, a certain type of storytelling. And I love it. I mean, I think it's great. I mean, you know, funnels where everyone just dies right away are also very fun.
They sure are.
And, you know, and like, I mean, you can have fun with other styles of gameplay, but this is a particular style of gameplay. And I think we're talking about enriching downtime moments, and I think it's a good one. I want to go on to that second scope of downtime, which is the sort of heading back to the village or the town in order to recuperate or resupply with the intention of going back to the dungeon, right? I will say that this is trickier to make interesting because it is almost by definition an unwanted backtrack, right? Yeah. Like, no one wants to leave the adventure temporarily to get more healing potions or have a bone reset or whatever, right? Like, it's kind of hard to make this sort of quasi-punitive moment, like, feel enriching and fun, but you can do it. I mean, maybe you don't have to. I mean, you could just kind of hand wave it and just do all the mechanical, you know, box ticking things you need to do. But I think there's a way you can make it interesting. And I think this is where good non-player characters are very, very helpful. It requires a bit of work before the party sets out initially, right? I think that while they're in the village or whatever, before they head out, I think you should try to introduce some really great NPCs with interesting problems or who otherwise have some kind of connection to the player characters, so that when the player characters do, perhaps inevitably, maybe not inevitably, but when they do come back to the village in order to resupply and recuperate, they have some NPCs they can interact with. They have some things they can follow up on. To my mind, what's really important in these moments is showing how the world is getting on with things while they're bopping around the dungeon, right? You know, if you have characters who are perhaps love interests of the player characters, you can get some fun scenes there. You know, if you have a cleric or a paladin, maybe a senior member of their order, you know, calls them in for a chat. Maybe there's this kind of ongoing, you know, B-plot problem that they're kind of dealing with, and maybe they can get some updates or maybe have something added to the adventure connected to that. You know, if you have a thief who's a part of a thieves guild, great opportunity to add some side jobs to the current adventure or to sort of enrich that kind of, you know, that part of the story. Merchants, that kind of thing. Like, there's a lot of ways you can use NPCs to interrogate what's happening so far, both at the dungeon, in their lives back home, and kind of how the two connect up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think, I guess first say, I know you're right in that you have to set all this up before the adventure starts. So you establish all the NPCs who are present, do some scenes where they interact with the player characters before they set off, because you cannot do it when they come back to the village. Like, oh yeah, hey, there's also this guy. Like, you don't have time for that. It's too disruptive. But also, I think there's a big plus to this approach, which you can let it be very player driven. So my GMing approach for this kind of return to the home base is that I would say, maybe mention that one or two of those established NPCs are visible or say hello or whatever. But then you can let it be really player driven, because an easy trap to fall into is you've invented these, let's say 4 or 5 great NPCs, and you have a favorite one, and that one is not your player's favorite one. And the temptation is to have, I don't know, Malthusius the wizard show up and like, all right, lads, how's it going? And then like, oh god, this guy. So yeah, you can sort of just mention one or two are there, and that will remind them that these NPCs exist, and they'll go talk to the ones that they actually like interacting with. And that, of course, again, is more feedback for you to figure out what's working and what isn't, and you can kind of press on with the parts of the game that are proving to be the most fun.
Yeah, that's great. Another thing I'll add here, in addition to having some choice NPCs or some NPCs that the player characters are connected to that they like, I think that rumors are really helpful here, right? Frequently in games like this, rumors are dispensed near the beginning, right? And
roll on the rumor table.
Yeah, you have these rumors dispensed and rumors happen, but they don't follow up on every rumor, right? They usually follow up on one rumor, right? Or maybe none. Maybe they're just...
Usually none in my experience.
Yeah. But here is where you have an opportunity to sort of, if you're a very clever GM, you can kind of tweak this a little bit, and you can kind of show how the rumor is starting to build into something more significant. Maybe the world is starting to change because of the rumor. Maybe the sort of drama or danger inherent in the rumor is starting to reveal itself, right? Here is where Dungeon World is really good, because Dungeon World, you can kind of organize these things on fronts, right? And then you can just adjust the fronts as needed to, again, kind of show the world like continuing while the player characters do their adventure. And I think this is good because it's kind of another way of like presenting the stakes of what they're doing, right? Like a major part of the stakes are we going to survive the dungeon? Are we going to get the treasure? Are we going to accomplish the mission? Are we going to come back and be lauded? And are we going to be able to store some cash away and go to the next thing, right? That's the principal stakes. But there's this other like part of like stakes, which are more setting focused, which is, what are your opportunity costs, right? Like if you're choosing to go do X and ignoring Y, what is Y doing, right? Like what's happening with Y, right? Life is just a series of opportunity costs. And this is a great way of reflecting that in game, in my opinion. So what do you think of that?
I mean, Jason, I play role-playing games to get away from my endless series of opportunity costs. But no, I think that's pretty good. Although reflecting that, I do think it's important that the home village kind of thing, this is like my let's just relax and chill out tip as well, isn't it? I think it's great to have 1 or 2 NPCs who aren't an opportunity cost for the PCs, right? In the sense that a lot of the time, and it's pretty good design, if you're only writing the minimum number of characters into your adventure or whatever, you want the ones who want something from the PCs, or the PCs want something from them, and so on. But I find it's really good to just have people who are really friendly to the characters, who just like them, who say stuff like, I like you guys, you're great. And it just makes, everybody likes, to be complimented, I guess, but also it does create this kind of connection to, this is something that we might lose if we mess up against the big evil dragon or whatever. It creates a sense of a place where you're from, even if it's just the last village you came from. Yeah, just sometimes have characters who don't really want anything from the PCs, who just like them. And it's sort of, it just increase. And then if you're playing a very dark game, one day they come back and the tavern is burnt down and the dog has mange, and that's how you get them. But I think it's an often overlooked part of the supporting cast.
Indeed. So let's talk about that third scope as I've presented it. The major downtime between adventures, okay? Now, I think here the downtime activities depend a great deal on how much time we're talking about, right? And admittedly, in most instances, I think you're going to just hand wave this and then get to the next adventure. You'll do your leveling, you'll, buy all your supplies or whatever you need to do to get started. But you're basically just going to go on to the next adventure, right? And that's perfectly fine. It's perhaps even preferable. However, I do think there's a way you can make it fun if you, want to enrich the experience. I have a couple of ways, which are, my ways. You listener or Tom may not agree, but I think this is a great way of doing it. These two ways. The first is what I call the reward session, and I put that in quotes purposely, the reward session. And the second way is downtime that shows the passage of time. So the reward session, similar to what I mentioned at the start of this discussion, it's just a session about having fun, kind of fucking around in the town or city, maybe getting into trouble, but mostly showing the characters at leisure. You can have a little urban adventure here. I'd make it probably no more than one session, and I would make the stakes fairly low. I mean, think of, for example, like those odd side quests in something like Skyrim, right? That are not part of the main quest and are just kind of a small, goofy thing, maybe humorous, right? You could have a session that is, I've done a session before where it's a pub crawl session. That can be a lot of fun if you handle it properly. They're kind of just moving from pub to pub, maybe like right after the adventure, the sort of classic carousing kind of scenes, right? They get some rumors about possible future adventures, which you can kind of take note of, see what they're interested in. You can come up with some games and contests. You can mechanize them so they feel kind of substantial. I think that's what Legend of the Golden Condor was getting at. Arm wrestling contests, drinking contests, things like that, right? You can have it be kind of a fun experience. Again, though, I think the key is you limit this to one session, right? You don't go past one session. Another thing, depending on the setting, and if you want something a little bit more dangerous, I think a session that's just like gladiatorial combat can be quite fun. There is in the Pathfinder world book. What's the name of that world? Galarian or something?
I have no idea.
In the Pathfinder setting book, though, there is this one little remote corner of the map where they have this like place where they do this contest called Green Blood on a Black Rock. And it's basically you go there and you fight a monster for fame and glory and money, right? And a basic setup. I love the phrase "green blood on a black rock." And
that is pretty cool. I have to say,
it's pretty good, yeah. And I've stolen it, and I will sometimes do a what I call a green blood on a black rock session. It's great if you have not prepared anything. It's really fabulous if you're between adventures and you have not ready the next adventure. A sort of gladiator / green blood on a black rock blood sport type session can be very fun. Players love it. Like players really enjoy this kind of thing. And it's a good kind of major downtime sort of activity. But basically the idea is you just, you set up a series of monster fights essentially, or combats. Maybe there's some money going on. You can cut away from the combat and do like little scenes. Maybe the thief is, working the crowd or whatever, there's all kinds of things you can be doing, that are sort of surrounding that. But I think it's another good thing you can do with that time with what I'm calling a quote reward session. That's one way, okay, of handling major downtime. The other way is anything you can do to show the passage of time. I think this is the significantly more interesting way. I think there are not many ways you can make your setting feel real. Having a way of showing the passage of time can be a really powerful way of doing it. There's a simple way, a simple version that I've done plenty, which is you ask a paint the scene question, in what ways has the town changed now that it's no longer being plagued by a colony of giant ants? Right? Have the players tell you that stuff. Let's see what it looks like. Or, it's been a year since you explored the Tomb of the Serpent Kings. In what ways has your home changed during that time? How have you changed? Right? Things that kind of reflect the passage of time, reflect, that kind of call back a little bit to the incidents that happened before, I think could be really good, really strong. And this doesn't take much time. This sort of simple version of showing the passage of time during downtime is very fast, but it can be very powerful. I think the more complex version of this, though, and very, very fun if you do it right, is the sort of home base, right? A base of operations that changes with time, maybe gets upgrades, and just generally reflects the progress of the characters. We've talked about stuff like this before in different contexts. And some games have this built in, right? Pendragon famously does this, right? You actually you have a castle that like changes with generations, right? You kind of show how those changes occur, and it has mechanical weight. That Dungeon World variant called Stonetop does this. Like a very central part of the experience is showing how the village of Stonetop is changing over time as the adventures happen. And you can do your own custom thing too, right? I mean, I did for Dungeon World for a year or so this campaign called the Company of the Three Kings, and a big part of that was during the downtime we made changes to the base of the Company of Three Kings. We showed how things were changing. We incorporated the treasures they found. We had some custom moves that handled different parts of the home base that they could interact with, and that was very enjoyable. That was a lot of me talking, but I have now gotten out what I wanted to say. And so, what are your thoughts about Major Downtime?
My first thought is that I'm a big proponent of major downtime between scenarios in ongoing campaigns. I think it's easier to handle than the rest and recuperation one. The ones I find easiest to do are campfires. Major downtime is the in-between one that I struggle
They're harder,
with. Yeah. But, okay, let me ape the classical rhetoricians of old and address your concerns in reverse order. So a quick note on the home base. That is fun. You got to be careful not to get bogged down in it, but it's really great when everyone can kind of build up their fortress as a team. I remember I'd never played the second edition, but certainly the first edition of Conspiracy X, the sort of X-Files-y game, if you remember that, maybe. That had a modern-day version of this, where each of your NSA agents, or what have you, had different, what was called pulling strings that enabled them to get stuff for their cool secret base. Like, the Air Force guy could get aeroplanes, and the sciencey guy could install a lab, and so on. And that was pretty cool. It's like building your ship in... it's not like building a ship in Traveller, because the GM does that by themselves.
Right. Yeah,
it's the opposite of that. Just a quick note on that. But yeah, okay. Showing the passage of time is great. And it's also the answer to a lot of your problems from getting from one adventure to the next. So I want to briefly talk about the ongoing Warhammer campaign I'm running, The Enemy Within. Now, some of the worst stuff in The Enemy Within are these weird, kludgy intro sequences where it tries to find a way to shoehorn your PCs from the previous adventure into the one you're doing now. And the reason for that is around that time, and I think, not so much nowadays, but, up to quite recently, there was this idea that you basically had to have every minute of your character's lives accounted for on screen. There was never any gap. And that's where you get these weird things like you finish Power Behind the Throne, and in order to send them far away to the pseudo-Russian land of Kislev, they get sort of thrown in prison and then forced to join a knightly order. It's like, what is going on here? Whereas what we did was we just said, okay, the next adventure we're doing is something rotten in Kislev. You're coming back to the city where you ended the previous adventure. It's been a year. What have you been doing? And then we spent our XP and everyone bought new skills and explained they'd been off being a mercenary sea captain or learning to be an alchemist and what have you. It just simplifies everything. You say what the start point of the adventure is, give a long enough time for it to be believable that someone had suddenly acquired the ability to, make poisons, and you're done. And then the other Warhammer connection here is, of course, The Enemy Within has great examples of the reward session. Shadows over Bogenhafen starts with you knocking about a sheep festival and generally enjoying yourselves after a rather fretful voyage to get there. And also that's how you introduce all the NPCs that you now are going to think about and be connected to. And Power Behind the Throne is largely set in the city during a carnival, so you are faffing around going to the opera, fighting a minotaur in the arena, all this kind of stuff. And that was a great session, by the way, with several characters betting against their friend who was in the arena. And it's a really good mechanism. One question I have about it, though, is I think it only works after the first session of the mini campaign or however many. So you need an adventure session, at least one or two, then you can do your reward session. And it can't be the last session either, because I think that would just be too much of a code. There would be nothing at stake, right?
Yeah, I don't like it. I definitely think it needs to be like, there's something coming after this, right?
Yeah, exactly.
End on that, right? Yeah, I mean, I think the key is not to overkill with it, right? And to make it really clear to the players that this is just a thing we're doing today, and
that is important. Yeah.
That's super important. Okay, great. Well, this was great. I'd say it was a great discussion, but I did most of the talking. A lot of my great discussion at you, Tom.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed it. It's fine.
Do you have anything else you want to add?
No, I mean, I pretty much agree wholeheartedly with your points. You'll be pleased to hear. So there you go.
Awesome. Thank you. Let's go to the next segment.
Hello, listeners. We have two important pieces of Codex news to share with you. The first is that the hardcover edition of Codex Volume 1 is now available for purchase through Indie Press Revolution. This book is an exquisitely crafted journey into the early days of Codex magazine. It features the first 13 issues of Codex, including the original test issue, Codex Blood, as well as the Discern Realities Dungeon World Annual. The book features 300 full-color pages, 150 GSM paper, a spot UV cover, and a ribbon bookmark. It's a fantastic collector's item and would make a wonderful holiday gift. The next thing we want to tell you is that November is Catch Up on Codex Month. We're very proud of the Codex magazine. We want as many people as possible to check out all the amazing game material and artwork found inside its pages. With that in mind, anyone who pledges $6 or more to the Gauntlet Patreon in November will get the first 4 PDF issues of Codex Volume 4 as part of their pledge. That's Codex Melancholy, Gold, Childhood, and the newest issue, Void. These are easily 4 of the best issues we have ever produced, and you can get them all for a single pledge in November. And you'll get a new issue of Codex every month so long as your pledge stays active. So please check out the beautiful hardcover Codex Volume 1 book and the Catch Up on Codex Patreon special. We'll have links in the show notes.
It's the Companion Adventures. Let's start with film. Kick us off, Tom.
Okay, I've got Aguirre, The Wrath of God from 1972, which is a film about, well, I should mention it stars Klaus Kinski and was directed by Werner Herzog and has an infamously troubled production history.
Very infamous, yeah.
And it's about a Spanish soldier called the Aguirre of the title, who leads a group of conquistadors. They're going down the Amazon River looking for El Dorado, the legendary city of gold. So you can probably see the parallels to Legend of the Golden Condor. And indeed, yes, the filming process was quite similar to the plot of the film in many ways, in that it was a disastrous journey, which, if you'll give me a moment, I'd like to quote from the Wikipedia entry on Fitzcarraldo, another film later that Kinski and Herzog made together. It goes like this. Herzog hired Kinski, with whom he had previously clashed violently during production of Aguirre, The Wrath of God. Their second partnership fared no better, and an extra even offered to kill Kinski. Herzog reluctantly declined.
Early Herzog is intense AF. It really is. Yeah. He's just like, he's a side character in The Mandalorian or whatever, right? No doubt elevating The Mandalorian, but I was going to pick that too, but you wrote it down first. So I will go with my second choice here, which is The Mission from 1986, starring Robert De Niro, I believe.
Jeremy Irons, is he in it, I think?
Is it Robert De Niro and who else?
Yeah. Jeremy Irons, I think.
And Jeremy Irons, yeah. It's been 100 years since I've seen it, but I remember it being much like Aguirre. It's very it's a great choice in terms of like the visuals, and also deals with some of the themes of Condor as well, with religious themes and things. So a pretty good choice there, and like Aguirre, a good movie.
Yeah, and the music from The Mission was done by Ennio Morricone, who I'd like to recommend in general as a good soundtrack for Golden Condor. So he has that sweeping 70s to 80s drama thing going on. So you want to steer clear of the recognizably spaghetti western stuff, but things like his track Kimai, aka Le Vent Le Cri, and there's an album I found while looking for another album I used to own on Spotify but could not find. Anyway, it's called Ennio Morricone Ethnic Themes. Sketchy name, but decent compilation. So give it a go. I mean, there's so much to find from Morricone that he had like a career of decades across all kinds of genres. So anything that is not too lounge jazzy and not too obviously from the Wild West, I think should do you pretty well. Fantastic. And you have one more, right? Oh, I do. And this is something that I think will be hard to Google, so I promise I will try harder than normal to actually put it in the show notes. It's a YouTube video of some modern-day festivals held by the Tupiniquim people, who are the indigenous group that appear in the Golden Condor adventure. So, I mean, there's a lot of people just wearing T-shirts and jeans, but you'll be able to see kind of what the Tupiniquim kind of traditional dress looks a bit like what their music sounds like to some degree, in as much as we still have it slightly, let's say, contaminated by European music and so on. But it's better than nothing. And I'd like to throw in a side note here, by the way, after hours of frustrated Googling for Tupiniquim music. If we needed more reasons for cultural appropriation to be bad, which we don't, I would like to say it's very hard to Google the indigenous Tupiniquim people these days, because the word Tupiniquim in modern Portuguese has been co-opted to mean Brazilian. So the phrase Cinema Tupiniquim means Brazilian film. So anytime you just go looking for the actual people's music or arts or culture, you just get Brazil in general. That's not cool.
No, indeed not. Well, listeners, that's our show. We hope you enjoyed it. Fear of Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find The Gauntlet on Twitter at Gauntlet RPG. We have a website, gauntlet-rpg.com. We have a set of forums. It's forums.gauntlet-rpg.com. And we are on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show with a little bit of money, that'd be great. It's patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. And thank you to our outstanding editor, Luke Wade.